Anyone who has ever come a little too close to starving probably remembers Vincent van Gogh's The Potato Eaters. Van Gogh painted it in 1885. The people in it are Dutch peasants, sitting under a dim lamp, eating potatoes in a room that feels almost damp to the touch. In one of his letters, Van Gogh explained what he wanted the viewer to see. He wanted these people to look like they had tilled the earth themselves with the same hands they are now putting into the dish. He was not just painting a meal. He was painting the way labor turns into food, and the way food turns into fate. The potatoes are buried in the ground, and the people almost seem buried with them. The brightest thing in the painting is not a face, it is the plate of potatoes. That choice matters. It is not there to make the scene beautiful. It is there to make it honest. In Van Gogh's Europe, poor people sat around a lamp and ate potatoes. In old China, when life got hard, people stretched rice into porridge. In much of lower-class Europe, people lived on rye bread and a pot of pottage, a thick stew made from grains, legumes, roots, and whatever else could be scraped together. Across the Middle East, and much of the dry belt stretching through West Asia, the most basic combination was often flatbread and beans. In many parts of Latin America, maize sat at the center of ordinary life. In parts of Africa, staple foods were pounded into dough-like masses and eaten with soup or sauce. On the surface, these foods look nothing alike, but the logic behind them is surprisingly similar. Welcome to my channel. This is To the Lighthouse. In this video, I do not want to give you a quirky little world tour of poor people's food. I am not interested in the kind of history that ends with, wow, people in the past really had it rough. What I want to ask is something deeper. How does poverty change the shape of a meal? Why do different civilizations, when pushed to the edge, keep arriving at similar answers? Why do the foods of the poor so often become soft, gray, wet, plain, easy to divide, and built less for elegance than for survival? Along the way, I want to talk about Van Gogh, Victor Hugo, Charles Dickens, Émile Zola, Wu Jingzi, and the worlds they wrote or painted. I want to talk about Chinese porridge, European potatoes and pottage, Middle Eastern bread and beans, and the place of maize in Latin America. And in the end, I want to come back to one question. Why is it that the truest image of a society is often not found at its banquet table, but in the bowl of its poorest people? The logic of porridge. Let us start with China. Chinese porridge was not invented because people suddenly became desperate and started pouring water into rice in a panic. It is much older than that. It is almost as old as grain civilization itself. A more accurate way to put it is this. Porridge was not invented by poverty, but it is perfectly suited to poverty. The first thing porridge does is stretch limited grain. If there is not enough rice, the most direct solution is water. Once grain absorbs water, the volume grows. The calories do not magically increase, but fullness does. The elderly can eat it, children can eat it, sick people can eat it, a whole family can stay alive around one pot. What English usually calls congee is, at its core, a way of turning a staple grain into something easier to distribute and easier to survive on. In Chinese literature, porridge is rarely written as something refined. It usually appears with embarrassment, hardship, or decline hanging around it. One of my favorite examples comes from The Scholars, or Rulin Weishi, by Wu Jingzi. Before Fan Jin finally passes the imperial examination, Wu Jingzi gives us a painfully concrete glimpse of what life looks like in his household. On the day the results are posted, there is no rice for breakfast. Fan Jin's mother tells him that she has a hen that lays eggs, and that he should sell it at the market, buy a few measures of rice, and cook some porridge, because she is so hungry she can barely see. It is such a good scene because it reveals the family's entire economic condition in one stroke. Here is a scholar, someone supposedly on the path to official success, and before he even leaves the house, there is no proper breakfast. The family has to sell a laying hen just to get enough rice for one pot of porridge. This is not comfort food. This is not wellness culture. This is not the kind of slow-cooked healing breakfast you see romanticized in modern lifestyle writing. This is the most basic buffer a poor society can invent. If grain is running low, add water. If the body is close to failing, drink porridge. What makes this even more interesting is that porridge was not just food. It was also a tool of social management. In imperial China, famine relief often did not mean handing out dry grain or cooked rice. It meant distributing porridge. Qing dynasty discussions of famine relief say this very bluntly. When famine has become extreme, and rice can no longer be distributed, one should find a way to distribute porridge. They even explain why. People who have been starving for too long can die if they suddenly eat dry rice. Food has to be given slowly, in portions, and carefully. At that point, porridge is no longer just something in the kitchen, it becomes a method for dealing with extreme scarcity. When a civilization reaches the edge of hunger, it stops asking whether food tastes good. It starts asking how to keep people from dying immediately. That is what makes porridge so revealing. It looks soft. The reality behind it is not soft at all. So what is Chinese porridge? It is an ancient grain form. Why does it remain so closely tied to poverty? Because it is exceptionally good at expanding survival space when grain is limited. And what became of it? It entered everyday life, famine, memory, and the long literary record of endurance, humiliation, frugality, and lower-class existence. The pot in Europe. Now shift the camera toward Europe. At first glance, the story looks different. But really, the crops and utensils have changed more than the logic has. For a very long time, lower-class Europe survived mainly on two things: bread and a large pot of something simmered together. In English, that something is often called pottage. It is not a single fixed recipe, it is a category. Grains, legumes, onions, cabbage, roots, scraps of vegetables, maybe a bit of meat if fortune smiled on you, all boiled together into one sustaining mass. If the pot was still going, life could still continue. In that sense, pottage and Chinese porridge are cousins. One leans more towards stew, the other more towards softened grain, but both take limited resources and turn them into something shareable, something that can keep a household moving. And bread, of course, was not the same for everyone. In Northern and Eastern Europe, rye bread remained a crucial staple for the lower classes, for a very simple reason. Rye is hardier. It grows better in poor soil and colder conditions. So if the land is bad, the climate is harsh, and money is scarce, rye becomes easier to trust with your life than fine wheat. The bread it makes is darker, denser, heavier, rougher. It points in the exact opposite direction from the soft white bread later desired by urban middle classes. And this is where Victor Hugo enters. Les Misérables was published in 1862, though its world reaches back into earlier 19th century France, from the post-Napoleonic period, through poverty, policing, convent life, barricades, revolution, and redemption. The plot, on paper, is simple enough. A poor man named Jean Valjean steals a loaf of bread and is drawn into a long, brutal life. But the real complexity lies in the question Hugo is asking. How does a society come to treat hunger as a crime? In the preface, Hugo says that as long as there exists, in civilization, the social asphyxia that degrades men through poverty, books like this cannot be useless. And when he writes Jean Valjean's backstory, he makes the detail of bread almost unbearably precise. Jean Valjean breaks a pane of glass and takes a loaf of bread. Hugo then notes that this was already the second time, in his study of penal questions, that he had encountered an entire catastrophe beginning with the theft of a loaf. That is what makes the writing so powerful. Bread is not a prop here. It is evidence, a tiny piece of evidence. Whether a man has the right to eat that loaf determines whether he becomes a convict. Hugo is not trying to romanticize theft. He is asking why hunger gets sent to the law before it gets sent to the kitchen. Charles Dickens works in a similar register. Dickens wrote industrial London into English literature with almost ridiculous clarity. Fog, cold, crowding, dirt, hunger, institutions that sound charitable and feel violent. Oliver Twist began serialization in 1837, and at its center is an orphan moving through the workhouse and the urban underworld. It contains one of the most famous lines in English fiction. "Please, sir, I want some more." Oliver does not say that because he is greedy, he says it because he is starving. But in that system, even a poor child asking for a little more becomes an offense. The ladle comes down. The institution reacts as though order itself has been attacked. Dickens is not writing a naughty child. He is writing a society that treats the smallest expression of appetite from the poor as a breach of discipline. That is what makes hunger so frightening. It is not only that the stomach is empty, it is that the moment you speak, you are told you have already stepped out of line. Émile Zola pushes this even further. In Germinal, published in 1885, he writes Northern French miners, industrial exploitation, unemployment, and the crushing economy of laboring bodies. Zola often describes poor people's meals not by dwelling on what is present, but by making you feel how little there is. Soup, bread, water, maybe a small bit of meat, and even then it goes first to the person whose labor matters most to the household's survival. Food, in Zola, is not flavor. It is ration. It is a question of who gets to deserve a mouthful. That feels deeply 19th century in the best sense. It captures the industrial age not through speeches, but through distribution. And honestly, that has not disappeared. Even now, a surprising amount of social conflict still reduces to the same old problem. Who gets what, and who has to wait? Bread and beans. Move further east, into the Middle East and across much of West Asia, and you find that the structure of poor people's food changes again, though the underlying logic remains intact. The image many people have of the Middle East is all golden light and abundance. Roasted lamb, spices, stories, carpets, lanterns. A slightly overproduced fantasy sequence. But the long history of ordinary daily eating is much simpler than that. At its most basic, the pattern is often flatbread, legumes, a little oil or yogurt, onions, dates, and whatever else can be obtained cheaply. Flatbread matters here because it is old, practical, portable, durable, and easy to divide. Naan belongs to this broader family. So does pita. Grain is milled into flour, baked into something flat, and instantly becomes easier to carry, easier to store, easier to tear apart, easier to dip, easier to share. On the other side are chickpeas, lentils, and fava beans. These are not glamorous foods, but they are reliable sources of affordable protein. The bread carries the calories, the legumes hold up the body. It is a modest pairing, but a very filling one. And this is where the 1001 Nights becomes unexpectedly useful. It is, of course, one of the most important story collections in the Arabic literary world, formed over a long period of time, full of merchants, sailors, kings, tricksters, beautiful women, urban pleasures, and restless imagination. It gives posterity a brightly lit world, but bright worlds can mislead. What kept ordinary people alive was not the extravagant feast, it was bread and beans. Literature often prefers the exceptional because the exceptional is memorable. But most of history is not a royal banquet. Most of history is a loaf, broken into pieces, and a pot slowly emptied. And this logic extends well beyond the Arab world. In North India, for example, chapati, an unleavened flatbread, is often eaten with dal, a dish of cooked lentils or split pulses. There it is again, bread and legumes, different names, different spices, different climates, different cooking methods. But for lower-class societies, the durability of this combination comes from the same basic achievement. It keeps the body working with ingredients that are cheap, stable, and available. Maize and dough. Go further still, into Latin America, and for many ordinary people the central staple becomes maize. That shift matters because it means the foundational crop has changed. In China, the staple might be rice or wheat. In Europe, wheat, rye, barley, and later potatoes. But in many Mesoamerican civilizations, maize was never just another grain, it was something much closer to a worldview. This is where the Popol Vuh enters the conversation. The Popol Vuh is one of the most important texts in the Mayan tradition, written down in the mid-16th century in the Quechua language. It tells the story of creation, the actions of the gods, and the origins and history of the Quiche people. And what matters for us here is this. In that creation story, human beings are finally made from maize. That is an astonishing idea. It means the staple food is not just what sustains life, it is what life itself is made from. When a civilization writes a crop into its creation narrative, it is telling you something very direct about dependence, value, and survival. And I have to admit, there is something almost funny and wonderful here. If the Chinese goddess Nuwa, who made the human out of clay, had read this, she might have looked up and said, "So there really is another version of me somewhere in the world." That is why so much ordinary food in Latin America rests on the logic of maize and beans. Tortillas, maize porridge, maize doughs, maize meals, all paired with legumes. Cheap, stable, sustaining. At first glance, this looks very different from Chinese porridge, European pottage, or Middle Eastern bread and beans. But underneath, it is doing the same thing. It takes the most dependable staple and turns it into a form that is easy to share, easy to stretch, and hard to do without. In parts of Africa, the same survival logic takes another shape. Staple foods are pounded into dough like masses. Fufu is a good example. It is commonly made by boiling and pounding starchy ingredients like cassava, yam, or plantain, then eaten with meat broth, fish, stew, or vegetable soup. What makes this so interesting is that it is neither rice, nor bread, nor porridge, and yet it solves the same problem. It can be divided by hand, it pairs well with liquid. It is extremely filling. At this point, the resemblance across human societies becomes hard to ignore. Some people soften grain, some bake it flat, some pound starch into dense dough, but all of them are trying to do the same thing. Make calories last longer. Make a meal feel more like a meal. Class at the table. And by now, the real question is no longer just what poor people eat. Food is never just food. It is one of the most honest records a society leaves behind. What appears on a person's table often tells you more about the world they live in than anything they might say about themselves. Van Gogh painting potatoes is not rustic lifestyle content. Hugo writing bread is not a celebration of French baking. Dickens writing, "I want some more," is not a charming child moment. Wu Jingzi writing Porridge is not a wellness essay about traditional eating. Once these details are placed back into their historical worlds, they become class. Who gets white bread, and who gets dark bread? Who gets dry rice, and who gets watered grain? Whose food carries meat and spice, and whose food survives by swelling with water? On the surface, these are differences in cuisine. Underneath, they are differences in resources, law, entitlement, and the value attached to different lives. One of my favorite literary techniques is when an author does not preach at you. He just shows you what is on the table, and slowly you realize that the whole social order is already there. Hugo does this brilliantly. Jean Valjean does not steal gold, paintings, or some dramatic state secret. He steals bread. And because it is only bread, the event becomes even more devastating. Society's failure is condensed into one ordinary object. Dickens does something similar. An orphan asking for a little more should be the most ordinary thing in the world. Yet inside the workhouse, it instantly becomes a crisis of order. Literature becomes sharp at exactly that point. It stops speaking in abstractions about poverty and starts showing how poverty enters the mouth and then enters the heart. So in the end, perhaps the argument of this whole video is quite simple. The rich use food to distinguish taste. The poor use food to extend life. The rich discuss texture, complexity, and pairing. The poor first ask whether one more ladle of water can go into the pot. Across different civilizations, poor people keep turning staple crops into strangely similar forms, not because they are copying one another, but because poverty pressures human beings towards similar solutions. Soften the grain, thin it out, flatten it, pound it, make it easier to divide, easier to share, easier to survive on for one more day. And that is why, if you really want to understand a civilization, it is not enough to study its most splendid feasts. You also have to look at its plainest survival meal. A single bowl can tell you what a society fears, what it lacks, and who it has placed last. That is all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. See you at the next lighthouse.